So first and foremost, I just want to say I'm not the best scratcher or the worst scratcher. It's just kind of like, you know, there's many styles. Some of it, what you're hearing was everything from Ornette Coleman to John Cage to, I don't know what, Pauline Oliveros. That last one says "We Are in Control" transmissions from an old 50s sci-fi movie, Time Stretch, to DJ Faust, Shorty, and Craze, or elements of James Brown, Joan Dubuffet, all in the space of about 5 minutes or so. So what you were just seeing is a kind of implosion of geographic and spatial signifiers, so to speak, whether or not it's records mixed from 1960s, 50s, 30s, 20s, you name it. All of this is simultaneous, and this is an issue that a lot of art critics, everyone from someone like Walter Benjamin with his essay in the work, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, versus Hal Foster and another critic named Edith Diak were dealing with as well in the 80s when they were trying to describe this sense of narrative implosion that a movement in painting called neo-expressionism brought about. But Edith Diak has a great essay. She used to write for Art Forum, was an editor there. It's called Chameleon in a State of Grace, and she was dealing with this notion of the artist as a nomadic thought process, actually. Instead of the artist creating a sense of like, all right, the static object, the painting on the wall, is now, you know, the finished product of the cultural production process. She was talking about the actual artist's life becoming a kind of a cipher for all the information, that, you know, because again, like late 20th century culture, we're dealing with a sense of extreme density, and artwork itself, there's so much previous historical work going on that most of my friends who are artists, who are painters, who are sculptors, who are computer people, you name it, everyone is kind of dealing with what, there's a guy named Deleuze and Guattari, two people, they call it the anxiety of influence. When there are too many influences going on, how do you create? When the artist is faced with this kind of extreme density of information to filter through and process, what becomes the end product of the artist's thought process. So there's different narratives going on here. On one hand, in the 80s you saw the explosion of painting, again, as a sort of reinscription of the gallery scene in New York or in London or Paris. But on the other hand, you also had the rise of groups based around critiquing media in general, whether it was EBN or Negative Land on one hand in the sort of art world underground, or people like, later in a certain sense, someone like Matthew Barney, who's dealing with biological surrealism. I don't know if you know Matthew Barney's work. He does movies based around his sculptures. So the end product of the sculpture is actually a short movie rather than the actual object. So you're seeing a sort of nomadic process where different forms of studio processes, whether you can remember like a lot of painting movements in the, I'd say the 1890s up until maybe the 20s, the focus of a lot of interesting painting became the artist studio. Like you remember people like Degas, Gauguin, Picasso, etc. They would all paint their studio in pictures. You know, there's kind of a focus on how the creative process originated in the artist's mind. So they'd be like, okay, let's critique this and paint the actual place where the paintings are painted. It's like an implosion of narrative again. But here at the end of the 20th century, the notion of the studio process has become so, how should I put it, dispersed throughout the culture. Anyone basically, as soon as you start channel surfing, as soon as you start pushing play and selecting different tracks in your CDs, as soon as you download files on the internet, as soon as you send files or email, back and forth, you're dealing with the notion of the studio as condensed into whatever particular object you're working with, whether it's a CD player, the computer, you name it. So there was a theorist named Walter Benjamin, who, as I mentioned earlier, sort of been critiquing this with what he called sort of the notion of the art object's aura, A-U-R-A, what is original, what is derivative, what's a copy. So this was an important essay in art history dealing with visual medium and film. And again, why I keep referencing film in a way, whether it's Matthew Barney's films or even someone like Man Ray's stuff, where he was dealing with surrealist notions of photography. You're seeing all of this, like what I was just playing in my DJ mix, you could hear fragments of film sounds. You heard everything from the Twilight Zone to old Dolomite records. You're getting to the point with culture itself as total theater, as total studio. And to make a long story short, there have been narratives in music paralleling this, and there's also been narratives in the conventional art world, whether it's Wagner in the 19th century trying to combine each character with certain motifs, whether they were visual or sound. That was kind of theater as Gesamtkunstwerk or total artwork. or later in the century, even someone like Andy Warhol or Joseph Beuys, where they threw events or parties continuously as a kind of a socializing process of how their art got out. In the 60s, that kind of notion of art as questioning the notion of a static object, whether it was Warhol's soup cans or Joseph Beuys' conceptual happenings, or someone named Alan Capra who's out on the West Coast dealing with the same thing. They also had parallels in urban youth culture. What you saw, the rise of poetry scenes of someone like the Last Poets dealing with like critiquing entire societal value structures with poetry and then recording it, or William Burroughs with his cut-ups in Morocco with someone named Brian Geisen, who was his partner in a lot of these. You saw the appropriation in mass culture of what had been previously viewed as an avant-garde terrain, whether it was the surrealists in the 20s or the Dada movements, critiquing sound and sort of doing hilarious sound movements, or the Italian futurists in the teens doing noise operas. Instead you now have Hendrix smashing amps and blasting the audience with noise instead of like an avant-garde, kind of thing. So I'm just using these as metaphors of the migration of avant-garde culture into mass culture. And these are serious issues in terms of art, and creative potential, because usually in the West, the art object is viewed as something divorced from the social continuum. It's something that you put on your wall and just stare at. Or on the other hand, the symphony is something that you go and sit and just respectfully look at the performance. Whereas, say for example, with DJ culture, you're immersed in the performance, and there's a kind of no single narrative. When you go to an event, you're walking around. Sometimes the stage is the central focus of the scene. Sometimes you just walk around, and there's no sense of a solid singular narrative. And I'm just using this as a metaphor. But you can even look at the internet as a similar parallel, where there's no centralized situation going on. It's dispersed information all over the place. You can look at TV channels. You can also look at the current sort of crisis in the art world right now, because there's no central narrative, and there's kind of a generation gap between the critics and the artists that makes for most art criticism being 20 years out of date, really, So these are all issues that younger artists, people in our age range, 20s, teens, 30s, will probably be dealing with as we grow and sort of expand out into electronic media. So I wanted to kind of just do this lecture as a conversation rather than a formal thing. And in that spirit, I was going to see if Gardner's videotape is ready. Do we have the videotape queued up? And just to show you an example of what a group of artists out of RISD, which is a school in the U.S. down in Rhode Island, these guys have been doing media critiques for years, and they kind of have absorbed a lot of what I'm talking about as well. But there's other groups, a lot of people do collective art, et cetera, et cetera. So once again, this is informal, and we're going to start, and then after this there will be questions, so I'll open either one.
I'm going to play a piece that we played last night, a new EBN theme track featuring Brian May on guitar, Bootsy Collins on bass, and Dennis Chambers on drums, and my partner Josh doing little bleeping sounds.
Can we cut the lights?
Can we turn it up a little?
Emergency broadcast network. Josh Pearson, and welcome to this special edition of Emergency Broadcast Network's sneak preview focus group screening of our exciting new 1998 season premiere of Emergency Broadcast Network. The trailers you're about to see are just a taste of the great things to come in 1998. We want to make TV special, and we want you to get ready for all the laughs, the drama, and the non-stop action of our upcoming 1998 season. And to help us understand our viewers' needs, your needs, we're conducting focus group screenings like this one. So tonight, remember, while you're watching us, we're watching you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as we give you a taste of things to come. Emergency Broadcast Network, can't hear you. Emergency Broadcast Network, Emergency Broadcast Network, can't hear you. Emergency Broadcast Network, Emergency Broadcast Network, can't hear you. Emergency Broadcast Network, can't hear you. Emergency Broadcast Network, Emergency Broadcast Network, can't hear you. Emergency Broadcast Network, Emergency Broadcast Network, can't hear you. Emergency Broadcast Network, Emergency Broadcast Network, can't hear you. Emergency Broadcast Network, Emergency Broadcast Network, can't hear you. Emergency Broadcast Network, can't hear you. Emergency Broadcast Network, Emergency Broadcast Network, can't hear you. Emergency Broadcast Network.
Working with Brian, Dennis, and Bootsy. It's always a pleasure working with them or their likeness.
All right, so again, you're seeing nonlinear narratives coming back. You're also seeing collage of radically different people moving in continuous kind of synchronized movement, you know what I mean? So it's that's kind of something I wanted to sort of deal with in the questions section, but on the other hand, it's crucial to remember the notion of collage, whether it was John Hartfeld in the 20s or Hannah Hawk, or even the bricolage work of Picasso or a couple other people, Duchamp, of course, finding the ready-made or using that kind of stuff. These are now issues that have kind of been absorbed by pop culture and have kind of become literally the whole fabric of the creative process of late 20th century cultural production. So whether it's from the art to the avant-garde moving into mass culture, or whether it's mass culture moving into the art world, you're seeing more and more of a kind of a diffusion of the boundaries between the two, and that's kind of why we wanted to play that one, because it's critiquing surveillance and TV images, stuff like that, but it also has a great sense of humor, and that's what any artist I think kind of needs to deal with right these days. So to make a long story short, anybody have any questions? It's open there, open ballgame. Sure.
Do you feel that your art has any inherent meaning?
Interesting. No, it's a good point. At this point in the ballgame, meaning itself is up for grabs, because on a lot of levels, if you look at someone like Mariko Mori, who's a pretty major art world star right now, or Matthew Barney, these people are dealing with this kind of intense implosion into like self. They're looking at their own kind of mythologies, if you will, and sort of creating whole micro-universes around their own stuff. My meaning comes from myself as an artist in a way, and so I'm just kind of looking at that as a sense of like art as continuous selection. Even the notion of Jamaica, where they call the DJ the selector. Its meaning is in the sense of how it goes out into the world and how other people use and reconfigure it. So like in a certain sense, I find my art becomes like a tool or a part of the process of creating other art. So perhaps it is meaningless in the sense of like, it's like software for cultural production. Like the records themselves become their own kind of generative syntax. So meaning becomes language almost, because this is our own, it's like Lego blocks, it's building blocks, and people put things together however they will. I actually like the idea of making records for other people to use. The artwork becomes a tool.
I guess, like, I was reading an interview, and you're placing a lot of emphasis on deconstruction, which of course disseminates any sort of meaning within any actual text, whatever the text is. So I guess this is more of a general question, but just to put it back to yourself, how do you find your art, why is it worthwhile if it doesn't have meaning? Of course, this is a question you can ask of anything within deconstruction,
right?
More specifically yourself.
Well, that has a whole kind of issue with this notion of cultural relativism that's going on in the academy at the moment. Like, I don't know if you guys remember, there was a kind of a big controversial thing. There was a guy named Alan D. Sokal that published an essay in Social Text last year. Do you remember that? He used all these kind of high-end theory terms about physics, and then revealed that it was a hoax later in lingua franca. So it was like the gravitational syntax and blah, 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 decentralizes the whole. It's a classic essay. If you ever get a chance, you got to read it. It's really funny. It's online at socialtext.com. But yeah, it was the essay was absolute gibberish. He was kind of, but because he had been using a language that was already established, he made his own remix of the situation. Which at this point, ask any DJ anywhere, the music is kind of like an emotional extension of their own value structure. Like, people get a kick out of hearing certain styles. That's what it becomes a pleasurable situation. Like, to just most people I know who are DJs just like kind of getting into the mix and just jamming around. And the audience themselves is actually more conservative usually than the DJ, because most people are doing it because they really like it. So I guess in a certain sense, it's the gravitational pull is in kind of like the sense of playfulness and pleasure. But on the other hand, deconstruction, you're right, it deals with these notions of both surveillance on one hand, where you look at Virilio, but he wouldn't, all these terms are being used very loosely. So you can look at Virilio, Foucault, Bars, Derrida, and in a certain sense, all these people play with language. It's a whole French kind of deconstruction ballgame. But then again, if you look at hip hop, that's how people play with language as well. They flip the script. That's even a classic sort of term. So language has always been, in a certain sense, of a lot of African American narratives. Like Brewer Rabbit, for example, was from the South. This character that could go up and like crack a joke and sort of always play with games, with people and trick people. But then you also look at Bugs Bunny, who inherited that out of the kind of media sphere. But late 20th century culture, it's an issue I always actually want to ask the audience. Most of my friends who go into art galleries and museums right now, there's a sense of flux. Like the values that are being thrown at you from art no longer really have the same gravitational pull as even watching a video game or a cool movie or something, And that's a big issue in terms of generational appreciation of visual culture. I have friends that don't even go to museums anymore. They're like, oh, I can just see the photograph. Who cares to see the original? And you know, it's like, wow, that kind of is pretty mind blowing for my friends who are older. But I kind of just, I feel like I'm at a crossroads in a way. Like, even the notion of the real object, you know, what is real, what has meaning. These are issues that the artists, like I have friends who are musicians that feel that DJing is not real and has no meaning. But then you go to a nightclub or you go to a party where someone's cutting and scratching and really breaking something down and the crowd's cheering. So it's like a social process, but it's an unconscious process because most people wouldn't go out of their way, like me, to burden themselves with all this theory baggage and everything. You know, they just kind of, they just do it. So, yeah, what do you feel in terms of meaning? Or I mean, I'm curious. It's a conversation. So. Yeah.
Well, I guess one thing people are doing in literature right now is looking towards past postmodernism, which is basically what you're talking about, and seeing the only worthwhile thing now is basically creating metafictions or meta-narratives, as in you can't create anything new, so you might as well use past things like collage, pastiche. So that's basically what you're doing. Of course, the problem is that postmodernism rejects all meta-narratives because you can't have a grand narrative. So does that just make it simply worthless, or are you just creating something like that essay, which is nothing more than a trick and a ruse, and there's nothing else really going on at all?
Well, you can, you know, doesn't it seem like most of the TV you watch is full of shit anyway as well? You know, the news, the media, everything seems to be kind of a fiction at this point. Like, in the U.S., we're bombarded, say, for example, with the biggest soap opera in the U.S. history, which is the Lewinsky trial. And that's, you know, got thousands of pages of footnotes. It's, you know, the Star Report, you know, Stargate, you know, at this point. No, it's, so it's, meaning is as how you can consensually create or create the fiction to the point where most people think it's real. And the media in the U.S. has been ahead of the rest of the planet by about 50 years in terms of fabrications. You know, there's a great movie called Parallax View, which came out in the late 60s, which is about sort of media and like kind of myths and stuff like that. But it has a precise trajectory about control and brainwashing and stuff like that. And it's at this point, ask any hacker, for example. They have a thing what they call social engineering, where if they want to get into a system, they'll call and pretend as they're part of the hierarchy and say, hey, we're having a problem down in room 501. What's the password for whatever? And because they're using the right language, they're able to access the person, and so the person usually thinks that they're part of the narrative, and then they get the password and then steal all the information later. But it's an interesting thing in terms of the late 20th century. There's no standard situation, so it's all just a flux of games and within games within games. You know, like when I watch the news, you realize the U.S. is kind of going through an attempted coup d'état. You know, I mean, basically, to put it bluntly. And it's viewed as was the president smoke? What brand of cigar was the president smoking while he was, you know? That's at this point, you know, might as well be a James Bond narrative where, you know, the advertising on, you know, everything Bond wears, whether it's the watch or the tie. You know, they had a whole thing about what tie Clinton was wearing. You know, so does that have meaning? Yeah. Next question.
Since you mentioned Kurosawa, you know, I think of the art. I think of the role of the artist in general, and Rashomon, that great film in particular. And it's, I guess, relevant to this conversation we're having about, you know, meaning and interpretation and reality, notwithstanding what we call the kind of, you know, impenetrable baggage of a lot of the current cultural studies type theory. It's a discourse that it's a discourse that sometimes promises to be political, but is understood by about 3 to 4 people.
Sure, right.
That's generally the way it goes. But I think of Rashomon, this idea that there's a single event retold many times from different perspectives, and that event takes on different meaning and different perspectives with every rendering. You know, and maybe it's a good way to understand, you know, the use of especially technology in contemporary culture, artistic culture. There's been a lot made about this kind of free-floating interpretation. Benjamin, you mentioned, I love the fact you mentioned that essay, which is, it's just, you never tire of it. And it's this idea of, you mentioned aura. And he talked a lot about the possibilities of contemporary, at that time, but contemporary technology assaulting the closure of cultural production, and in fact the tyranny of high art. So he saw it as democratizing and ultimately political. There is a question in this. A lot of the new analysts of popular music and culture, especially African American, I think of the work of George Lipsitz and Tricia Rose, not African American, but Russell Potter's stuff on repetition, which is, I think, very cool. You know, all of them talked about, you know, the political dimension, not like a coherent political practice in that way, but that somehow the kind of artistic projects that you've been talking about and some of the artists and theorists that you mentioned are involved in what they see as a political project, but it's about democratizing. It's
right.
about the sense of, you know, audience as producer and so on. Getting rid of that line that has been almost tyrannical and separating art from everyday life, from people, you know, the cathedrals of art and so on. And it seems that, you know, I wonder if maybe you see contemporary projects and use of technology precisely in that term.
Yeah, I mean, well, technology definitely democratizes the entire cultural ballgame. But you'll find that what people usually try and nail the sort of democratizing project of technology is the nail in the coffin is taste, you know, and that perhaps becomes a late 20th century issue, because if meaning is meaningless, then at the end of the ballgame, then it just becomes taste, you know, what everybody kind of thinks is cool or is not cool, you know, bottom line. And
Sorry, it's
yeah.
interesting.
But
you said that meaning is meaningless. I keep thinking of this idea, you know, I think it's in the introduction to Crash, J.G. Ballard.
right, technology.
Yeah, he talked about, it's a neat little flip of an idea where he said that the fictions are around us. They're proliferating at an incredible rate. It's all, you know, a pile of bullshit for the most part. Fabrication is your word, and it's a great word. He said the role of the artist somehow is to invent the reality. You know, that artists in his sense were not involved in part of the fabrication, but in fact the constant commentary, restructuring, challenging, assaulting, that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, I think Ballard's really brilliant. That's a great introduction, by the way. It's probably one of the best. To Crash, J.G. Ballard, it's a brilliant story. I think it's set in, no, Cronenberg did a movie on it based in Canada a while ago. It's a great movie. Well, I like elements of it. It could have been shorter. But in general, I guess I don't want to say meaning is meaningless, because there's definitely a pretty ruthless logic, and I'll reach back in time and sort of splice the tape there. You know, meaning becomes a series of embedded expectations, almost, you know, about what should be what and where the box is and how language or what you're doing fits into the established cultural box of what is art or what is not art or what is real, you know, or whatever. But it just gets to the point where you have to think about how you live in the everyday. I mean, you walk down the street, you say, for example, one of my favorite things, I just wrote this piece where it's like leaving like a restaurant and being greeted by Miles Davis saying "Think Different," and then Picasso saying "Think Different." Then you turn left and it's like, you know, Sean Lennon and Yoko Ono saying "Think Different." You know, in New York these ads are all over the place. I don't know about up here, but it's this Apple kind of thing of like genius level meta narrative or something. Like if you purchase their product, you have you can upload to the level of these people or something. But it's just kind of at this point in the ballgame, these kind of issues, you just have to deal with the emotional content of what you're doing. I think if you get a kick out of something and take it to the full extent of where you want it to go, then that's perhaps art. And you know, so these are issues that anybody in the late 20th century as a creative individual will be dealing with. And I'm curious as I travel just to see how different artists and writers deal with it, because in a way, every artist has always been involved with the project of building their own world or their own representation. I mean, you know, so It's only in the West that this has become such a difficult problem, you know. Like in India, for example, they have posters that combine, you know, religious Hindu motifs with selling, you know, hot chocolate, you know, on a street, and it's a great, you know, sort of painted poster or something, you know, like, and you'll see the posters all over the place, and no one really blinks an eye. But in the U.S. or the West, if something sort of goes out of the sphere of the museum as almost this religious hierarchy about taste and class and higher, you know, caste, then it becomes an issue. But at the end of the day, you know, the narrative will just keep going regardless of whether or not we're in a room arguing about what's real and not. Kids will just get access to stuff as they always do and take it to a different level, you know. I mean, who would have ever thought that kids in the South Bronx would just get turntables and start ultra collage culture, you know, instead of William Burroughs or, you know, this kind of artsy downtown New York thing. And it was the most prescient and intriguing art form of the late 20th century. Was born in the ghettos, you know. It wasn't product of academic arguing and finicking back and forth about meanings of real or not real. It was just some kids who got a kick out of doing something. So, what's the next question?
But I guess the question I have is like, with DJ culture, especially now, like where, you know, you're paying like $10, $15 for a record like every time, and like there's this intense consumerism that goes along with the culture, and I mean that's obviously an element of like this relativistic kind of like hyper consumerist, hyper real world that we're dealing with. And I don't know. I guess I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that level of it. You know, from the price of access to this culture.
Price of access. That's a good point. In fact, yeah, that's a great. I like that phrase, price of access. Yeah, it's a pretty hardcore situation. I mean, I know kids that will save up for months to get a turntable, just as well as, you know, I've had nightmare stories of DJs being stalked, you know, just for their vinyl, you know, like, like I have, my place got robbed once when I was traveling, and the only thing they stole, I have about 25,000 some odd records, lots of books, artwork at my house. The only thing they stole was my computer and all the stuff associated with it, which was right on my desk. And they just took all my discs and files and nothing else, you know? But it gets to the point where, yeah, the consumer situation, like the Japanese call this generation otaku, you know, which is, it's Japanese for just total hyper-consumer. But on the other hand, look at Russia, you know, where the anti-consumer motif just led to ultra-corruption in the government, total, you know, repression, psychological control. So we have these two extremes going on. One collapsed and the other's totally succeeded. And you get to the point where in this post-perestroika world, where the only alternative, on the other hand, is intense nationalism and maybe perhaps religious fundamentalism to get out of it. Like in Afghanistan, for example, they burned all the TVs a while ago. Did you read about that? You know. And anyone who had access to technology above a certain level, if you didn't get rid of it or burn it, you were taken out in the street and shot, you know. So it's a world of many meanings. As it gets to the point where I really feel like in 20th century and as a presage to the 21st century, we'll always have these situations where meaning just becomes a process of whoever has the most guns, you know, and whatever government issue or whatever, you know, kind of secret service or you name it, can just make these rules apply and stick, or else, you know. But on the other hand, as artists, we can critique, make, and spread information, I think, you know, and that's what I was trying to sort of demonstrate by having EBN play the video, you know, like they had the CNN reliable sources, did you see them? You know, so, these are all issues that are open, and on another level, that's what you can use technology to liberate or to repress. You know, control the information or just completely shatter it. Like look at Tiananmen Square in China and how they were able to get out the fact that it even was happening. You know, in the U.S. we've had all sorts of political, you know, stuff go on, but you never hear about it at all. You know, and so it's interesting that we have to look to other countries, but. On the other hand, there's all sorts of stuff going on in the U.S. that never gets reported. And like there's a recent study in the UN about human rights abuses And usually they always say, oh, you know, in Africa or the Philippines or China, but they actually, as a way of rebuking the U.S. is kind of a hypocritical take on all that. They did a study of human rights abuses in the U.S. And it's a recent report, it's published all over, and it's through the roof. You know, you think you live in a very industrialized country and everything. But to bring it back to your question about consumerism is, are people buying this? Do you see what I'm saying? Like the information about the information. If you give it credence and validity, then you've accepted the price of the ticket or price of access. And to be completely honest, I think on a generational level, we're probably the most apolitical. You know, most people in the U.S. don't really. Most of my friends don't. They're like, oh, voting, I don't know, or you know, yeah, who feels like it's all full of shit? Fuck it, I don't even think about it. But on the other hand, if you don't vote, then usually it's the right-wing types that do. You know, they go every fucking week. You know, they vote. So that's why I think the Republicans are going crazy in the U.S. is because the culture itself has moved way past any notion of is getting a blowjob at work a bad thing, consensual, remember, versus, you know, whether or not the Bible-thumping hypocrites who are all having sex with their interns too, whether or not they can actually get that information out, you know. Like, most of the politicians in the Congress barely even have websites up, but they rushed immediately to get the Star report out, you know, on the internet. Stuff like that. So it's a play over access to the cultural production process. But we have these in our hands, these tools as artists and writers and cultural producers as well. So it's interesting how here we have a point where all the tools are there, but again, the prices of access is so dispersed that no one even, it's just as much you're part of the system as you use the telephone or wear leather shoes that were made in Malaysia, you know, or if you're using paint that was made by peasants in Mexico in the south someplace. It's ruthless logic, really. So it's at this point, most kids are just, hey, I want to play Nintendo, I want to go to McDonald's, I want my new pair of Nikes. You know, what's the next Michael Jordan product endorsed? You know, so is that art? I'm not sure. Yeah.
Awesome. I was just wondering, listening to your stuff, like I noticed that the beat seems to take on a secondary role in a lot of other DJs and test work, listen to work at more. So I'm wondering what it means to you to work with rhythm, work without rhythm, and why does it sort of seem to be like kind of a secondary thing for you?
Well, there's a lot of issues with that, especially in the New York downtown scene. There was kind of this tyranny of the establishments, whether it was the hip-hop establishment or the techno establishment or the rock establishment. Everyone had these kind of formal rules of procedure. And I remember like just DJing at parties in college, which is mainly where I started spinning. Like the kids would come up to me and, you know, just basically act as if I was a jukebox, you know, play my request or you know, whatever. So part of me is kind of like, you know, just giving the middle finger to the whole process. I don't know. You're right. It's a bit self-indulgent in a certain sense, because if you're the DJ, you have to make sure everyone's dancing and everything's nice and smooth. But on the other hand, I like the idea of shattering the rhythm and somehow making it disjunctive and letting these weird moments seep out into the mix, you know, like rhythm clash or suddenly the rhythm goes slower or faster. That's how, to me, when I DJ, it's kind of like a digital exorcism. It's getting these strange rhythms in my head out. And whenever you kind of think, I don't know about you, anyone else, but when I deal with my own thought processes, nothing is linear and smooth and clean. It's always, you remember things back and forth. You might remember, you walk down the street and you'll smell a smell, and it might not be so intense, but it'll trigger all this other stuff. Or if you're in the middle of, like, you hear a sample that you're familiar with and it goes away, you know, stuff like that. I play with that. I mean, I don't consider myself to be a conventional DJ, so I don't really, or I'm not a battle scratcher guy or something. It's a hobby, it's fun. But there are other people who really focus strictly on rhythm, and there's room for it all, really. Yep.
I wanted to go back to Access for a minute. Do you broadcast your work, or where would you like to broadcast it?
I haven't got around to that because I've been super busy dealing with just kind of trying to get this weird intropic DJ style out. but I'm planning on doing more broadcasts soon. I have a lot of friends that have pirate radio stations or weird radio shows. I'll give them mixtapes and I'll just play it, but I plan on starting an internet broadcasting soon, but there's only 24 hours in the day. And I'm traveling and DJing and writing a lot, so haven't gotten around to that yet. But I'd say internet broadcast would be perfect, but in the U.S., I don't know about Canada, but the federal government in the U.S. is extremely hardcore about tracking down pirate stations. And access to radio for public uses is also really limited. There's a good movie called Bullworth that came out a while ago. I don't know if anybody saw it. And Warren Beatty was just talking about how the federal government had sold the airwaves for billions of dollars, every month. I mean, you realize every single second you're even tuned to radio, that's thousands of dollars, just like abstract money, keeping that frequency there. And also you got to remember, even the TVs that we watch, the frequency spectrum that's available for visual media is basically huge, but you're limited to a couple channels that are precisely controlled and paid for. And the TV should just be like a radio dial where you can get those little in-between places, but they don't even build a TV that you can access the in-between channels, you know what I mean? So to me, the in-between channel is the mixtape and getting that out. And sort of bypassing the established hierarchies of how music is normally gotten out, whether it's a major label, which I can use too as a tool. And I don't mind putting my stuff out on a major label or a smaller label, or just making my own stuff and giving it out for free, which I do a lot too. So that's why I broadcast at the moment.
Going to art, what you said before about just having fun, right? You're just doing it, and that's art. But you're saying all this stuff like, I'm using a major label and there's this whole establishment set up. Aren't you really, and you're using a lot of breaks, like your rhythm structure, you're saying you don't want to play with the regular rhythm structure. Aren't you in effect by just having fun? I don't think you're just having fun.
No, I'm not having fun.
You're trying to say something deeper, right?
Sure, yeah.
And you're using that whole construct, like the whole system and everything. And like what you were saying before about, artists just having fun. I mean, they're just doing it, right? They're just sitting and doing it, and it's just, I think you have to go beyond that.
Sure, I mean, that's me, but other people will, my own personal take, I don't speak for other people. I always try and make sure you guys know this is my, Paul Miller's individual viewpoint. It's not the objective narrative of late 20th century, whatever, just my take on it. But in a way, like, there's a critical threshold that you get to the point where, all right, you're working whatever medium, and you're like, all right, what is the meaning of what I'm doing? How do I want to get this out? What is the intention? I would say a lot of people in general will just leave it at that. They'll make something and they'll just let it go. In the 70s, there was a kind of a crisis in the art world as well, when minimalism was kind of fading a little bit. It was Jean Dubuffet. And the artist took on the role of the critic because they were so frustrated with the critics. And so you have the success of someone like Joseph Kosuth, who would start writing entire books about one, show, or someone like Jenny Holzer, who would put her exact phrase that she wanted people to see up on a digital screen, rather than having the critic come in and write about it or something. So it's more like control of the perception of the artwork that I'm dealing with. And in New York, it's pissed off people. Some people love it, some people hate it, and that's cool. I don't mind either way. I like the idea of somehow trying to create a place where you can have a critique of what's going on, but also not go nuts. Because it's a weird, like I said, threshold point where you realize, holy man, it's like everything I'm wearing is made of toxic stuff. Somebody was exploited in Malaysia to make my shoes. I brush my teeth and you realize the fluoride is actually really, terrible for certain things. Or if I go to just walk on the street, like the amount of basic pain everyone had to go through just even for the city to exist. It's mind-boggling. But once you get to the point where late 20th century, most culture is totally commodified across the board, what next, And that's what I'm kind of trying to use my artwork to point towards, is what is the next area, which is cross-cultural collaboration, sending information beyond just your local geographic region, creating art as a forum for different energies to go, out into the world and stuff like that. Because at the end of the day, anybody can sample anything, but if you can't deal with the people who are from different cultures or use it to build a bridge, then it's just an empty gesture,
Also, like, things are so commodified that anytime, that's why we throw free parties.
Mhm.
Like, anytime we make a gathering of people that doesn't involve money as the medium by which people gather, there are possibilities.
Sure.
Whether that's a demonstration or a riot or something like that, or it's a party out in the woods.
Right, I throw free parties in New York a lot, and I also throw parties that you have to pay for because it's just too expensive to put it on alone. And I think that there's room for both, and you can have free events and still have the police show up, no problem, and you'll get a fine, and end up losing a lot of money. I mean, we got a $3,000 fine once for a free event that we had, we didn't even make flyers. We just put out a little voicemail number to show up at this parking lot, and we had boom boxes going. And the police came. New York is under Mayor Giuliani. I don't know if you got it, but he's just. They even have signs at bars, no dancing. If someone even kind of just like, the police will just. So. Yeah, no. So it's.
You guys laugh, but there's in Vancouver, you have to have a license to dance in restaurants. In the restaurant where I work at, people
Yeah.
were dancing like we were told. And really can't let them dance. What's happening right here?
So I mean, I've had events, where the police. There's a party we do called Abstract, and the police and fire department came, like sirens rushing. Someone was dancing. And I was like, no one was dancing. And I said, what is a dance gesture, Mr. Officer?
You can do it though.
Yeah, he was like, So it gets to the point where that's what I'm saying. Interpretation-wise, it's wild. No, but we got a fine, and it was like pretty heavy. And we all had to throw another party to pay for the lot. And that was a paid party because we needed to pay the money. So, any more? Yep.
Speaking of regulations, what do you say to people who ask you about copyright?
To me, copyright is an interesting situation, especially in terms of late 20th century, because anybody can copy anything at this point, if it's online, or if it's just a cassette, a CD, mini disc, you name it. If you can't copy it or crack the code to copy it, you can find someone else that can. I mean, there's. I like the idea of what they call public domain, where it's like stuff just goes out and anyone can make copies, and but without fear of retribution. I mean, there's a group called Negative Land that does a critique of this kind of stuff, and they've always gotten hassled. But just recently, they had a CD that had, I think, a small fragment of like the Beatles or something, and the recording industry in the U.S. tried to shut them down by going to the actual pressing plants and saying, don't put this out, or we will sue you to the ground. Basically, like we'll just destroy it. But online, a lot of people started sending the recording industry's main office email saying that this is fucked up, this is bullshit. And so they actually dropped the suit and let the CD go out. And the CD, lo and behold, hey, it didn't harm anyone, it didn't destroy the Beatles, And so I really think there's a kind of issue where most people just don't get the idea of that sampling is more like a homage, and it actually. Like, say, for example, when Puff Daddy worked with Jimmy Page, the Led Zeppelin sales actually went up, the original versus the copy or whatever. It doesn't hurt people, and in fact, the U.S. up until only 30 or 40 years ago was kind of a major importer of intellectual property, and Britain used to sue the U.S. regularly for copying, all sorts of stuff. And, if you look at blues and how that was appropriated, or even the way the U.S. was appropriated from the people that lived there, it's kind of a weird paradox when anyone says, "Oh, I own this," or "This is my thing." I kind of think everyone is a collective producer, like we all share in the cultural process, and probably computer culture in general will make that kind of stuff obsolete soon, I think, because you just won't be able to control it. You can copy anything and change it and flip it around.
I guess the issue is whether it's being used for resale.
For resale. Now, even if it's being used for resale, unless you can prove that it's the exact copy and all that kind of stuff, like for example, on my album Rhythm Warfare, the last track is a woman singing a Buddhist mantra about recycling. And that's public domain. And the label was like, we could get sued by someone or something, and it just didn't make any sense. Because this is a mantra that most people with a certain sect of Buddhism have been chanting in their own way for 1,000 years or so, So all of these are issues that I think should be questioned and somehow made to be rendered in a way that's just like, hey, you know what? Anything goes at this point in terms of cultural production. But the corporations make a lot more money if they can make people believe the illusion that they have to continuously deal with copyright law along those lines of like, licensing and whatever. But at the end of the day, like, say for example, Gardner makes his own mixtapes of video stuff, and he'll just give them to friends or sell them at parties, or I make mixtapes I give away because I make money doing other things or something, There's a way of trying to bypass most of that, and in fact, it's a huge culture of mixtapes and weird sampler, like exchange files, MP3 files, stuff like that online already. I'd say within the next couple of years, it's just like trying to, applying copyright law, that kind of stuff, is just like having water run through your hands, you can just try and grab it, but it'll just go,
Can I ask you one last question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I wrote it down because I'm kind of nervous and I thought I'd forget it. So you said that your art is a reflection of the environment, and I can only assume that you mean your internal environment as well as the external environment.
Sure.
I don't know if this is true, but okay, because you talked earlier of psychosis and things like that. And as art in the world, in all mediums, is kind of increasingly jumping into the global blender, like, so to say, dealing with appropriation and collage and pastiche, like things we've already talked about. How do you think that this reflects the human condition?
So, oh boy.
Is that a too tall order?
No, that's a great question. The question was the sense of entropy, basically, in culture and all the stuff flowing around and mixing and meshing. How does it affect the human condition? I can only speak as a citizen of the industrialized, or at this point, relatively post-industrialized U.S., where people just take most things for granted as accessible, that even a couple hundred miles away in the rural South, for example, is a problem, or when you get to Mexico or South America. I mean, it's truly a strange dichotomy between the northern industrialized countries versus the southern, quote-unquote third world. Whereas before the dichotomy was east-west, Russia, U.S., Russia's satellites versus the U.S.'s satellites. It's now north-south. And it's increasingly kind of a debate about access to resources. This goes back to the notion of price of access. Like China is just now getting into cars. Like their whole thing is like, status symbol. The Soviet-oriented, bureaucratic types, of course, get the cars and the houses, and everyone else is kind of, left out in the cold. But the human condition, I really think it's getting to the point where we definitely have enough machinery to make food to feed everyone. We have enough machines to clothe most people, to give most people shoes, a decent amount of food, and a house. But it's not happening, and in a way, the dichotomies between the industrialized countries and the non-industrialized, especially when you remember that the bulk of the world's facing a kind of economic implosion at the moment, it's probably going to get even more intense. I mean, sort of Charles Dickens' kind of Oliver Twisted return, Oliver Twist, sorry, not Twisted. It's just, and it's not even something, if you think about the actual impact of the economic situation on most people's lives outside of the industrialized countries, it's pretty grim. But even if they send aid in and food and stuff, like say for example in Somalia or Yugoslavia, where they sent food in to these people who were desperately hungry and they needed food, the ruling cliques of each country would then take the food and the medicine and sell it to their own people, and rip them off. Stuff like that, where it's just like ultra twisted. But I have a friend, for example, we grew up in the same neighborhood, and she studied forensics, I think it was Harvard, and she has to go to war-time countries to determine what methods were used for mass murders, so she goes in with computers and stuff like that and just like, for example, she just got back from Rwanda a while ago, and she said, "Oh, they invented some new techniques, Paul." You know, I said, "How do they, you know, what, you know, like for covering up mass graves and stuff like that?" And you know, it's just the bulk of the world is living that way. You know, bottom line, and it's kind of the U.S. or Europe or Canada. You know, there's a kind of sense of unreality. You know, I have friends who are from Pakistan, for example. There's an artist named Shazia Sikandar. She's a great painter. She's from I think Islamabad, and she was just talking about, like, you know, in the capital of the city, you know, people with guns walking around, and, you know, like, if she's a woman not wearing a veil, she'll be stopped by the other Muslim, you know, men saying, "What's going on?" Or there's an artist named Shirin Neshat who makes video work. She's a great, brilliant artist from Iran, and she deals with Muslim fundamentalist issues in her work. And the human condition, you know, viewed through the filter of these other people, you get a radically different picture than, like, you know, Calvin Klein ads or, you know, Think Different, you know, Apple ads. It's a serious dichotomy, and it's actually, I think, as our role as artists is to try and show different perspectives, not just accept what's already here and just say, "Oh, isn't it nifty that we now have computers?" But these are issues that, again, I can't speak for other people. I usually try and just deal with my own views on this stuff. So I think the human condition, we're definitely in some sort of late 20th century dystopia, you know, where it's like things that could have gone well. Yeah, I remember the U.S. was founded on sort of a utopian ideal, you know, like we want freedom, we want to be able to get under the, you know, no taxation without representation, that kind of stuff. So was Rome, you know, Rome was founded by the people fleeing the Trojans and all this kind of stuff. And it's when you get to that utopian thing that the worst excesses go out, you know, because people feel they're validated by the objective of whatever ideology they're working under, you know. So, human condition, I don't know, it's as we all see it. Yeah.
Sorry, you know, we're out of time because there's a class that comes in here. So just before everyone leaves, just a couple of quick notes. I just wanted to tell everybody, in case they didn't know, because I can see there's a lot of people here that aren't from SFU, that we're putting on this ongoing series, Cultural Production at SFU. And the whole idea is we're trying to sort of construct a space where some of the things that we do at the School of Communication up at Simon Fraser, or some of the more theoretical work, can sort of find space with actual people that are doing stuff like Paul, DJ Spooky, or Gardner and EBN. And we're going to have an ongoing series of events. We're doing another one in a week on Saturday, 10:30 in the morning at Blinding Light Cinema. We're doing a play, The Fever by Wallace Shawn, and everyone's welcome. And in case you didn't notice, we have a little donation jar, and that's just so that we can, if you enjoyed this and you feel like putting in a few bucks, that would be great, so that we can do more events like this. And finally, I want to thank Paul a lot, and Gardner as well, for coming in on really short notice and doing such a great job.
I have one last scratch.